Hi, everyone, and welcome to the final event of Rewind, the Shenson Retrospective Film Series. I just want to let you know that we have every intention of offering this series again next year around a different theme. This year, the theme was Jewish women filmmakers. So please stay tuned. If you don't already receive a Rewind or Toby Center newsletter, you can put your email in the chat and I will add you to our list. So my name is Shana Hammerman. I'm the Associate Director of the Toby Center for Jewish Studies. And I'm just thrilled to participate in this year's series with award-winning filmmakers, critics, and scholars. And as you know, as I've said, we focused on Jewish women filmmakers for this series. Fittingly, one of the first films that we discussed this year was Susan Seidelman's Smithereens, in which a bored and desperate woman in New York dreams of making her way to Los Angeles. And today we end the series with two films about ostensibly bored and desperate women in Los Angeles. So it looks like the West Coast might not solve all problems. We will have a Q&A, and this really is a conversation. So while we will hear from our guests independently and ask them some questions ourselves, we really invite and encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A function, and we will get to them after we hear our speakers. So I'm so thrilled to introduce today's guests. First, we have Maya Montañez Smukler, who heads the UCLA Film and Television Archives Research and Education Department. Her recent book, Liberating Hollywood, Women Directors and the Feminist Reform of 1970s American Cinema, is available from Rutgers University Press, and it was the 2018 recipient of the Theater Library Association's Richard Wall Memorial Award. Welcome, Maya. We also welcome Adam Kirsch, who is a poet and critic and an editor at the Wall Street Journal's Weekend Review section. He's the author most recently of The Blessing and the Curse, The Jewish People and Their Books in the 20th Century. Next, we have Paloma Eisenberg, who is Rewind's undergraduate director. She's a junior at Stanford, majoring in theater and performance studies. And finally, Eitan Kensky, Dr. Eitan Kensky, the Reinhardt Family Curator of Judaica and Hebraica collections at Stanford Libraries, who really spearheaded this entire series. And it's been just such a delight to work with him and to be exposed to amazing films and people. So thank you, Eitan. We will start hearing from Maya, then we'll pass it to Adam, and then we will open it up for Q&A. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. And it's so wonderful to be here with everybody today and to talk about these two films, Clueless and An Afternoon Delight, and the filmmakers Amy Heckerling and Joey Soloway. So to begin with some thoughts about these two films, what does a comedy about a rich Beverly Hills teenage girl who is an expert shopper, obsessed with social status, friends, and boys have in common with a dramedy about a 30-something-year-old woman on the verge of a nervous breakdown, buckling under the bourgeoisie pressures of motherhood, PTA meetings, wifedom, and therapy? Well, sex, of course, is the common link. In Clueless, released in 1995, written and directed by Amy Heckerling, the protagonist Cher, played by Alicia Silverstone, and her two best friends, Stacey Dash as Dion, Brittany Murphy as Ty, talk about sex over lunch. Dion explains that Cher is saving herself for Luke Perry. "You see how picky I am with my shoes, and those only go on my feet," Cher explains in further defense. Cher then chides Dion, who confirms a similar status. "My man is satisfied, but technically I am a virgin." Later, after Cher fails her driving test and Ty and Cher bicker about crushes, Ty snaps, "You're a virgin who can't drive." "That was way harsh, Ty," gulps Cher, taken aback with tears in her eyes. In Clueless, the only physical contact that we see on screen is kissing, but sex, as in have had it or not, is dropped throughout the film in seemingly random ways. These moments don't move the story, but they are significant in how the bits of information not only frame the characters, Ty as the new girl from out of town in need of a makeover is more sexually experienced, Dion, and especially Cher as the lead, retain a sexual purity that works to balance their excessive materialism and social superficiality. But also sex functions to set limits within this teen film, a genre that can often be oversexed. In Joey Soloway's feature film debut as writer and director, Afternoon Delight, the main character, Rachel, played by Kathryn Hahn, struggles with her sex life that is derailed by marriage, parenthood, and the expectations of a privileged life. Sex then is a source of comedy. Sexual curiosity motivates Rachel's soul searching as she seeks out a friendship with Juno Temple's McKenna, a sex worker. Eventually, the act of sex becomes dangerous, creating between characters conflict, deceit, resentment, disappointment, and hurt feelings. Ultimately, though, sex for Rachel in the final scene represents a rehabilitated romantic harmony with her husband. And most importantly, for herself, as in the final moments of the film, capture her alone in the frame in the throes of her long lost, absent orgasm. Sex on screen is also a way in which to historicize these two films and their makers. Clueless was not Hecklering's first teen film. In 1982, she directed her first feature, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, written by Cameron Crowe. The script was based on an expose he had written for Rolling Stones magazine when posing undercover as a teenager. In 1982, Fast Times falls in an awkward transitional place for the teen genre. It was rated R for its scenes of sex and drug use and some serious drama, and therefore follows the other R-rated, raunchy, and unruly teen young adult comedies like Porky's, which was released in 1981, and Animal House that came out a few years earlier in 1978. But unlike the male-centric Porky's and Animal House, Fast Times, while featuring an ensemble cast and several overlapping storylines, is a film anchored by a female character, Stacy, played by Jennifer Jason Leigh. The film is then a precursor to the female-centric teen comedies made by John Hughes, specifically his collaborations with actress Molly Ringwald, starting with 16 Candles, that was rated PG in 1984. These films that define the 1980s teen comedy had fair amounts of slapstick and horny jokes, but they were also driven by Ringwald's sensitive and introspective characterizations. Fast Times was a surprise hit for Universal Pictures. The studio underestimated the film and its potential audience, but Hecklering struggled on that movie as a first-time filmmaker and as a first-time woman director in 1982. The 80s is a decade in which more women were hired to direct studio films since the silent era, but still the numbers were low compared to men and the struggles very real. In an R-rated film with much sexuality, Hecklering fought and was forced to compromise with the studio for better and more equitable representation between her female and male actors. Hecklering has described Clueless as a movie where everything came out the way I wanted. It is a film that is explicitly optimistic. Cher is a joyous character, and the film's visual style is bright, colorful, shiny, and emulates its protagonist's buoyant personality. As a PG film with sex and virginity, staples of the teen genre kept in check, Cher's innocence smooths out her assertive personality, while also keeping the character self-assured in that sex is her choice. Sex as a noticeable yet understated theme also shows the ability of Hecklering to grow as a filmmaker, building a body of work over years and playing in a favorite genre, the teen film, sometimes on her own terms. Where Clueless marks Hecklering's experience as a filmmaker a decade plus into her career, Afternoon Delight is Soloway's jumping off point. In many ways, the film goes over familiar territory, the tropes of an unhappy, frustrated, upper middle class, white stay-at-home mother who acts out in the face of her marriage in order to find herself. It is a film very much about how sex impacts relationships and sense of self, how sex is about physical, economic, and romantic power. Afternoon Delight's significance is about what Soloway does next, their breakthrough as the creator of Transparent and I Love Dick. These two shows, episodic shows on produced and released by Amazon, have much explicit sex. But what pushes the sex scene over is the uncensored emotional tenor of Soloway's characters. A generation younger than Amy Heckerling, Soloway begins an exploration of gender, sexual identity, and erotic desire that coincides with contemporary social justice movements. And social justice movements that Soloway has been deeply involved in, for example, passing of the Marriage Equality Act, the increased visibility of trans activism, anti-racist activism, specifically within the entertainment industry, and coalition building around gender equity. Soloway's growth as a media maker lands them at a pivotal moment during industrial shifts. The creative influence and financial power of streaming platforms such as Netflix and Amazon to produce original content in direct competition with broadcast television and feature films has disrupted existing models of production, distribution, and exhibition. In this media landscape, sex sells in varied ways, and female pleasure finds a place up front. Soloway and their collaboration with Han in exploring something that begins in Afternoon Delight splinters in many complex, daring, and controversial and funny ways in the projects that follow. Sex and Women Directors, therefore, has a history. By pairing these two films, we are also able to see beyond broad categories and consider Amy Heckerling and Joey Soloway as individual filmmakers and the history that they are making. Adam, I will pass it to you.
All right, can you see me? Have I got everything turned on properly? Thanks very much for including me in today's discussion. And actually, Maya, I have some of the same passages and quotations that you discussed I'm going to be mentioning, so I guess that means that we are on the same wavelength. When I watched Clueless and Afternoon Delight again to prepare for today's discussion, I realized that I was just the right age to be in the target audience for each movie when it came out. In 1995, when Clueless was released, I was a teenager, just a couple of years out of high school. In 2013, when Afternoon Delight came out, I was in my late 30s and a parent of a child the same age as Logan, the son of Rachel and Jeff in that movie. Geographically, Clueless was closer to home for me. I grew up and went to high school in West Los Angeles, while I've lived most of my adult life in New York City. Sociologically, on the other hand, Afternoon Delight feels far more familiar. My high school, Alexander Hamilton High, was only a couple of miles from Beverly Hills, where Cher Horowitz attends the fictional Bronson Alcott High. But of course, it wasn't remotely the same. No high school could be, not even Beverly Hills High, because Clueless exists in the fantasy world of romantic comedy, where just about everyone is rich, beautiful, and delightful. In this sense, it has less to do with Los Angeles than with Highbury, the English country town where Emma Woodhouse lives in the Jane Austen novel that inspired Amy Heckerling's film. On the other hand, I've never lived in Silver Lake, the neighborhood in Los Angeles that features an Afternoon Delight, but my experience of the Upper West Side and Park Slope makes the film's Silver Lake seem familiar, with its hip-striving parents who are Jewish enough to send their kids to preschool at the JCC, but not so Jewish that they keep kosher or observe Shabbat. In a 2018 interview with the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, Amy Heckerling said that she never intended Clueless to be a Jewish story. Cher only has the last name Horowitz, she said, because Wallace Shawn improvised it in a scene where he's taking attendance in class. Apparently, if you look closely at the report card that he gives Cher, it says Cher Hamilton on it. However, she went on to say that in my mind, you're always writing versions of people you know. And to me, it felt like I was writing about the daughters of people in show business in LA. That sounds like code, especially since Heckerling made Cher the daughter of a Beverly Hills litigator and cast the role with a Jewish actress, Alicia Silverstone, and then cast Jewish actors like Dan Hedaya and Paul Rudd as her father and love interest. Perhaps Heckerling didn't have to imagine Cher as an explicitly Jewish character because the world she created was pervasively Jewish, so much so that even Cher's best friend Dion, who is Black, uses the word kvelling. Conversely, perhaps Joey Soloway could cast a non-Jewish actress, Catherine Hahn, as Rachel because that character is so explicitly Jewish. For all the obvious differences between these two movies, I think they do have something significant in common, beyond being set in Los Angeles and having Jewish directors. Clueless and Afternoon Delight are both concerned with the question of respectability, what it means for a woman to be respectable, and how to draw the line between those who are and those who aren't. In Clueless, as in Emma, respectability is unapologetically related to social class. Cher is socially respectable because her house, car, and designer clothes are expensive, and by the local standards at least, tasteful. All this makes a clear contrast with Ty, the Brittany Murphy character, who is not respectable and needs to be made over in the way she dresses and talks. But in the movie, as in the novel, the Jane Austen novel, the heroine must learn that respectability is a moral quality as well. To become worthy of Josh, Cher has to prove that she is considerate, selfless, and intellectually curious, just as Emma has to prove to Mr. Knightley. Even the Austen-era idea that female respectability involves sexual modesty finds a place in Clueless, as in few other teenage movies. As Ty famously says, Cher is a virgin who can't drive. And in the film's value system, being a virgin contributes to her respectability. Dion, too, is praised by the film for delaying sex with her boyfriend Murray, if not until marriage, at least until their relationship is mature. And the turning point is the scene where they are in traffic on the freeway and she almost gets them killed and he manages to save them and sort of talk her down from her anxiety. That's sort of the transition moment that shows their relationship is stable and solid enough for it to be okay for them to sleep together. The treatment of sexuality in Afternoon Delight is realistic and thoughtful in a way that Clueless doesn't aspire to. But here too, the question of respectability is front and center. When the movie begins, Rachel's marriage is completely sexless, to the point that she and her husband only talk about sex in code, asking whether they should put the dog out of the bedroom. This makes McKenna, the prostitute that she takes into her home, a figure of fascination for Rachel, and she's clearly inspired by McKenna's matter-of-fact attitude towards sexuality. But the film also makes clear that Rachel is too respectable to be comfortable in McKenna's world of strip clubs and sex work. When she works up the nerve to go with her to see a client, Rachel ends up panicked and disgusted. In the end, her allegiance is to the middle-class code of marriage and motherhood practiced by her friends at the local JCC. That's why she doesn't hesitate to throw McKenna out when she sleeps with one of their husbands. Uncontrolled sexuality is dangerous and disruptive. The challenge for Rachel is to reconcile it with respectability. In a classic romantic comedy, that achievement is symbolized by a wedding, as at the end of A Midsummer Night's Dream, where the lovers wake up from the sexual anarchy of Puck's spell and reunite with the right partners. In Afternoon Delight, where the lovers start out already married, the last scene involves passionate lovemaking between Rachel and Jeff. In this sense, Afternoon Delight and Clueless are both traditional romantic comedies with happy endings, in which the heroines find passionate love while remaining morally and socially respectable. That kind of comedy can only take place in a milieu where respectability is a real value, which means that the community must be intimate enough for a woman's reputation to matter and rule-bound enough for violations of the rules to be serious. It says something interesting about American Judaism that Heckerling and Soloway both find LA's very secular Jewish community to be traditional and cohesive enough to fit the bill. So that is my remarks, and then I guess we will move on to dialogue.
Before we do, I just wanted to note for everyone that Melissa Broder is obviously not here with us today. Unfortunately, her car broke down outside of Death Valley. And as she pointed out, it is very good that her car did not break down in Death Valley. So hopefully we will be hearing from her soon, and that above all, we would hope that she gets out of the desert and gets back to LA. It is a reality and not allegory or metaphor, but sometimes those two can be very close. So I want to thank everyone for coming and for their presentations today. And just before we move into any kind of questions that we've prepared, I did want to ask, was there something that you've heard that you'd like to respond to?
a lot, but I'm fine with you doing your questions. I took notes on Adam's talk, so I'll be able to squeeze my questions in. I don't want to disrupt the structure.
Sure. So Adam, why don't we start here? I want to pick up on this notion that you mentioned about the Jewishness of the family in Clueless. And I really like the way you described it as kind of a pervasiveness, that there's a pervasiveness of Judaism in the West LA and Cluelessness versus an explicitness in Afternoon Delight. But I wonder if we could explore this concept just a little bit more. I mean, I agree with you that I think it's kind of code when she says that it's about a certain type of connected family. And also, it seems like a bit of a hedge to kind of blame Wally Shawn for coming up with the name Horowitz, that she has full ability as the writer-director to undo that ad lib if this was something that was not wanted within the film. And that also that in the mid-1990s, the primary connotation of Horowitz is probably going to be Adam Horowitz or Ad Rock of the Beastie Boys. And Beastie Boys appear on the soundtrack to the film. One of their songs from Ill Communication is the soundtrack to the skateboard scene at the end of the movie. So I think my question is really, is Clueless a Jewish movie? And so again, for the purposes of the series, the only criterion was biography, that the director had to be a Jewish woman. But is the family in the film Jewish? And if so, really, does that matter at all? As you mentioned, Silverstone, Rudd, and Hedaya are all Jewish. Seemingly dozens of women who go to Cher's high school have bandages from nose job surgery. That was something I only noticed this time watching the movie, but it is there, it is present, and of course the signifier of the last name Horowitz. So, is this a movie where it is Jewish, but the Jewishness does not matter, or is it, to go a step further, a joke about a certain kind of assimilated Jew?
Well, I thought it was interesting what Maya said about the two different generations, and I think that applies to the difference in these movies as well. As directors of two different generations, I think that, like a lot of pop culture of the 1990s and earlier, but certainly the 1990s, Jewishness is sort of a little bit coy. It's concealed. It's coded. If you're Jewish, you can definitely see it and detect it, but if you're not, you might not, or you don't have to. I think of Seinfeld as a perfect example of that. In Seinfeld, the Jerry Seinfeld character is Jewish. The other characters aren't, but of course they really are. And all of the reference of the show are very Jewish, about marble rise and black and white cookies and, all the Upper West Side stuff. And if you compare that to example with Curb Your Enthusiasm, which Larry David went on to make after working on Seinfeld, 10 years later, he starts making Curb Your Enthusiasm. In that show, all the Jewishness is out in the open. And so they actually do things like go to synagogue and observe Jewish holidays and make jokes about there's a whole episode in which Larry discovers that he was actually adopted and that he's not Jewish, and how that changes his whole expectations of himself and his character. So I think that reflects a sort of cultural evolution towards greater multiculturalism, where instead of everyone trying to pretend that they're white and they're sort of all the same, there's a lot more openness about difference and the ways in which people are particular. And that's certainly true in the difference between these two movies, where in Afternoon Delight, the fact that the character is Jewish and goes to a JCC and at the end lights candles for Shabbat is front and center in the movie in a way that it sort of maybe couldn't be in Clueless.
Yeah, I would just adding to that important scene at the end where she does light the candles and she sort of demonstrates that she's willing to kind of break down some of those boundaries that were established around not being too Jewish. She maintains that, at least for the audience, because if we imagine what that scene would have been like had she actually chanted the blessing over the candles in Hebrew, what the audience might have felt like in that moment about her, or how alienated they might have felt from her. So they're still policing the boundaries of what's too Jewish, even as they're opening up the possibility to be more explicit, I think, in that scene and in that film compared to Clueless.
So I want to stay on the question of definitions for a minute. So I mentioned that the only criterion for this series was biography, not subject matter of the film. Afternoon Delight poses the opposite problem in a way. Jill Soloway now identifies as non-binary, uses they pronouns, and goes by the name Joey. The film, however, comes from an earlier time in their life. It is a woman's story, and the film seems to want to make statements about womanhood, motherhood, and female sexuality. So obviously there are schools of criticism where we really never engage with the biography of the artist. But if you've decided to use biography as a factor, how do you respond when biography changes like that?
I think about it in terms of creating a body of work and having room in which to grow as a filmmaker. And that inevitably is going to include the filmmaker's identity, life experience. In the case of Joey Soloway, their sort of redefining gender in terms of who they are. But we could look at this in lots of different situations or lots of different occasions in which an artist, their filmmaking style changes and shifts. But the luxury of being able to build a body of work and have that sort of creative growth that might mirror or be connected to personal growth is really key. And if we're talking about women directors, we think about that in a different way, or we think about that, well, specifically in this conversation, talking about women directors, and then of course other folks who are marginalized within the film industry, based on various forms of discrimination. So, in one way, thinking about hecklering and how I was thinking about how sex shows up in Fast Times and then Clueless, there is a shift. And of course, it's about, the industry and about styles and popularity of genre, et cetera, from the early 80s to the early 90s, but also her ability to build a body of work and work through artistic vision. Sometimes she's forced to compromise. Sometimes she's able to have it her way. Same with Joey Soloway, that they are able to make afternoon delight at that part of their career and then explore and explode. And, when we talk about women directors, there's so many instances. And of course, many of the women that you have focused on in this series did not have that luxury, privilege, opportunity to build a body of work. Claudia Weil is one that stands out to me. Of course, she had a great career directing theater and television, but as a feature film director, she makes those 2 films and then it shuts down. So I'm always interested in a filmmaker's catalog and their ability then to explore this question of, personal biography, artistic expression.
I think one of the things that I really appreciated about your book, Liberating Hollywood, if we can stick to your research right now, is the kind of, the intersection of the second wave feminism and the studio system, and how the employment structures were changing at the time, and what did this look like on the ground? What did it actually mean to kind of have not just the ideology of second wave feminism, but people advocating and working towards this and trying to create change within their movement? So by the time we get to the 1980s, that's a little bit after your book. And in some ways, I think that it's, for all of the reasons you talk about in that book, it's very defensible to include Joey Soloway's work in this series, because when they made the movie in 2013, they were still, at least outwardly, a woman in Hollywood, struggling with a lot of the same structural issues that women in Hollywood were facing. So I guess my question to you is, do you think there was an appreciable change in women's ability to make feature films within the Hollywood system? And if so, when did that appreciable change really start? Because as you say, there are more in the 1980s, but when does it start to feel as if it's moving?
It's such a good question. Oh, it's such a paradox. In the 70s, that's the first generation, figurative generation, that breaks through. So there's 16 women. Well, that's really small. That sounds terrible. But significant compared to previous generations of just one woman director, Ida Lupino, for example. In the 80s, we see more and more women directing studio films like Hecklering or Nora Ephron, Barbra Streisand, but also independent filmmakers, so much. And that vibes with what's happening just in independent filmmaking in the United States. So, in the context of the 80s, when we look at industry and culture, we can kind of gauge those numbers. In the 90s, in some ways it opens up more, I think, independent filmmaking in the 90s becomes much more commercial, and maybe we'll at some point talk about other teen films with female protagonists that are being made same time as Clueless. But today I think the opening up for women filmmakers, those who identify as women filmmakers, and then also just filmmakers who identify their gender beyond, a binary, is just exploding. And that connects, I think, to, some of what I said in my opening comments, that the media landscape is so different and the social justice movements are really, so much change, of course, has to happen, but so much change is happening. And this generation of filmmakers is really moving the needle in a significant way because of those, because of how film or content, is being made.
Right. So film and Hollywood had to change dramatically in order for film and Hollywood to change dramatically.
Yeah, exactly. I don't even know what film in Hollywood is anymore, because now I'm just talking about streaming content. I mean, Hollywood is just so behind, right? I mean, streaming content is and that's film and episodic and everything that blurs together. That's, I think, where real radical changes are happening.
So I want to stay with biography for a minute, but the biography of people who watch these movies. So I am what society has now decided to term a geriatric millennial. This is the new phrase. Before I would have said I was an exennial, or even just an older millennial. But for me, what that means in terms of these movies is that I saw Clueless in theaters and then dozens of times on VHS in the mid 1990s. But I haven't come back to it for quite some time. So Adam, you spoke a little bit about the biographical resonances of you being a little bit older than them. For me, it's the opposite perspective of I was a little bit younger than them, and as such felt as if they were impossibly old, not anywhere connected to me. And only watching the movie now did I start to think, they probably would have been seniors when I was a freshman in high school. We're really kind of in this same cohort group. So I guess my question for both of you is, what is it like to returning to something that seems so rooted in a particular moment in time and a particular space? What parts of it play maybe as well or better 25 years later? What parts of it still seem resonant? What only becomes legible now as we go back to something that is so locked in a particular moment?
Well, I do think that Clueless is such an artificial movie. It's such a fantasy that it sort of escapes the moment in a certain way. Especially the comparison with Fast Times at Ridgemont High is a good one. I mean, with that movie, you're in such a specific milieu with the mall and the mall looks and the way the school looks and the cars people drive and the way people behave and talk. Whereas in Clueless, everyone talks in this sort of made up language that no one ever talks in real life, and they wear clothes that no one really wears. So it's all sort of candy colored and larger than life. And that sort of makes it a fantasy and less situated in a historical reality. And I think that maybe Beverly Hills is a fantasy zone in the movie, and as it is for a lot of people who see Beverly Hills 90210 or things like that and think of it as a fantasy land, and that's where Clueless takes place. And I think at one point Ty even says, everyone here at this school talks so well. Of course, they're talking the way teenagers don't talk then or now or ever. And one of the things I read in doing a little research about the movie is that Alicia Silverstone said that when she was making the movie, she often didn't understand the lines. She didn't know all the vocabulary that she was being asked to use. So she just sort of played it as if Cher was very confident and knew what was going on, even if she didn't. So I think that might be a good index of the distance from real life also. Whereas Afternoon Delight is very recognizable as LA. I mean, that's like real places that you could really go to and see people like the people in the movie.
Can I suggest something, which maybe you'll disagree with? I think Eitan might disagree with this, that I think Afternoon Delight is a fantasy in a different kind of way, but still a fantasy, because I think that it leans hard into certain stereotypes about these communities and that they become sort of parodies of themselves. The men go surfing and get high, and then they're in a band together, though the husbands, I should say, while the wives go and drink wine and chat about their sex lives. There's this sort of, or the way that they have these fundraisers. These things are reflections of some reality, but amplified in the same way that we might think of Cher's life as being a reflection of a reality, of a real kind of high school with a certain class of students, but amplified, right? So it's less amplified in Afternoon Delight, but it somehow convinces us that it's real. While watching it, I just kept thinking, like, this is just one step too far. These people don't feel real to me. So I want to know if you have opinions about that.
I mean, I think it's slightly heightened because it is a comedy, and obviously everyone is sort of maybe 10% over the top. And there are certain characters that are obviously funny characters, like the therapist played by Jane Lynch, is sort of always revealing her own personal life. But that scene at the school carnival, I've been to school carnivals, and that seemed exactly the way they are, like 100%. It didn't seem at all exaggerated to me. In New York, people don't go surfing, but I feel like even the divisions between, you know, what the mothers are responsible for and what the fathers are responsible for, all of that seemed pretty well observed to me. I thought that, I think the central fantasy of that movie is that no one like the Catherine Hahn character Rachel would actually bring a teenage prostitute into their home. That is the fantasy, and that's sort of like what the story is about. That's why it's an inciting incident, because it's something that wouldn't happen in real life, and so it forces people to expose things that they usually keep hidden.
Yeah, I've come to think of this movie as being predominantly about someone who has a bad therapist, and how they need to actually have a better therapist in order to achieve a lot of the self-actualization that they're supposed to achieve. But if I could take that a little bit farther, that's kind of a joke, but it's not really. It seems to be about the concept of self-care, self-improvement, wellness, and just, in fact, how selfish that is, or how selfish it could be, because it takes place outside of the context of every other social dynamic that's going on. That this is a case that the Catherine Hahn character is on this journey to improve one particular aspect of herself to the expense of every other kind of dynamic within her life. That not caring about the relationship, not caring about the school, just kind of moving particularly into the self-actualization, routine. And, to the extent she is successful, because at the beginning of the movie, she gets a car wash, and at the end of the movie, she decides she does not need to get a second car wash. She has, in fact, kind of moved along this journey. But I do think that Shana is right in that it is trying to be satire of its particular moment in time. And this is what Adam's capturing as well, that it's this glance at the particular class and the dynamics of this class and what they are doing. So there's a shot where they're kind of deciding which kids go in which car as they prepare for a play date. And the car on the left side is a Prius, and the car on the right side is an Audi. And I thought to myself, that's right. There was a time before these people would have been driving Teslas. This is just how it would have been in 2013 in this exact kind of moment and community. So maybe that actually kind of leads us to a different point, which is a question of style. So Adam, this is exactly what you were talking about with the language of Clueless, that the language being so heightened, the clothes being so heightened, as if they could not exist in reality. And yet it kind of became the reality as Clueless became so popular. So I guess my question there is, did Clueless invent a particular mid-90s aesthetic that we now turn back to and think, oh, right, this is what it was like? Question for everyone.
I said there was just an article I told you in the New York Times, I think, about mid-90s fashion, and the cover picture, the headline picture, was a shot from Clueless, a screenshot from Clueless. So it is the place that at least journalists are sometimes looking at when they're trying to figure out what fashion looked like in the 90s. Though I can say I was a teenager in the 90s and didn't see many people dressed like that myself.
I think the Josh character is kind of the most realistic character. That is very much how I remember people in the 1990s dressing. The flannel shirts, the baggy pants, that he seemed completely normal in a sense. So why don't we go back to the initial framing?
Also, I think.
Oh, yes, please.
Sorry, I think I might be a little bit delayed. You might be getting me on a little bit of a delay. I think that Clueless might maybe also, I mean, if you want to get super granular, and here I'll draw on my own experience again. I was born in 1976, and I think that in the early 90s, when I was becoming a teenager, was the grunge moment. And for me, the real Generation X movies are movies like Reality Bites and Singles, and the music is like Nirvana. And it was, the grunge aesthetic was sort of sullen and slackerish and resistant and unglamorous in deliberate ways. And then by the mid 90s, I think there's a deliberate reaction to that, and Clueless is part of that reaction. Then you get something like Clueless or Friends, which are very sanitized and sort of prettier than life and idealized. And it's as though all of that sort of dissonant energy of the grunge moment is being washed away. And I think that Amy Heckerling, Fast Times at Ridgemont High is a lot closer to the grunge feeling than Clueless is. Clueless is sort of like the Disney version.
I'd like to also think about, this question of how Clueless and Afternoon Delight, but Clueless more because it's an older film and has influenced so much of these examples that you're giving. The style, we know certain references, we know style, fashion, attitude, because Clueless coined it. So thinking about how these films are sort of locked in a particular moment, and then even going back to the questions you were asking, Anton, in the beginning about about what makes these films Jewish. I wonder what makes these films LA films, because they are very white. They are, Afternoon Delight is entirely white, and that is not Los Angeles. Even in a Jewish Los Angeles community, it's inaccurate. And so, if we can think about these films, sort of within a kind of bigger landscape, literally, figuratively thinking about Los Angeles. I think about Clueless also with Boys in the Hood, John Singleton's film that comes out in 92, close. 1991. That is another iconic, it's a teen film, it's serious, of course, it's a drama, but it's an iconic Los Angeles film about a specific LA community, Black Los Angeles, South LA, full of style, full of vernacular. And so how might we put Clueless in conversation with with what LA really is, which is such a diverse city, even in neighborhoods that, maybe aren't as mixed, there's still so much mix in the city of Los Angeles.
I think that matches Adam's comment about how Clueless is like a Disney production in a lot of ways, right? Because Cher has one Black friend and she has one Asian friend, right? So there's this sort of United Colors of Benetton fantasy that they put in front of us, but without any of the acknowledgement of the differences between these people, or the sort of, that there's culture and things that come behind this. They're all the same. And I think we have a little glimpse of that also in Afternoon Delight. There's one of the moms is Asian, right? And she appears on the screen as a kind of nod to the fact that, okay, the community is not all white. But for all intents and purposes, it is, right? So I think that's what you're pointing out to us. And race would matter in both of those contexts, and the films don't let race matter. Should I ask a couple questions? Okay. All right, this is kind of my big question. Is about how the films are sort of telling the same story. They're both about a privileged Jewish woman who tries to inject energy into her life by saving people who are less fortunate. And in both cases, the less fortunate woman's sexuality poses something of a threat, which is something that you started to talk about, both of you. Ty is decidedly not a virgin, and of course, McKenna is a sex worker. And in both cases, these women they're saving are lower class. Remember, Elton rejects Ty because, do you know who my father is? And McKenna is maybe living out of her car. But the outcome of their attempts to save these poor women doesn't change the women, right? McKenna seems worse off. She falls off the wagon. We don't know where she's going to go. Her life isn't made better by this experience. Ty ends up with the guy she liked from the very start at the end. So she's not sort of changed in the way that Cher might have imagined either. Cher and Rachel get to change, while Ty and McKenna go back to where they belong, right? And my question for both of you is, are the films asking us to applaud Cher and Rachel for their attempts to help the less fortunate, or are they satirizing something that we might call the Jewish savior complex?
And just adding on to that, yeah, I had like the same question, and sorry, it's loud, but it just felt to me, it just felt very performative. Like when all the women were, and they're preparing for the fundraiser, like, are you signed up? Like, are you volunteering? It was kind of like, who could impress who more, and who was doing the most for the Jewish community. And then when she says, well, I'm actually bringing this this teenager into my house, so I'm like doing good, but then she kicks her out and ends up on the street. So I had that same question.
I think in line with what Adam has articulated so well about Clueless in its sort of cartoonish style, which is of course why we love this film. Yes, Cher is meant to succeed, but in Afternoon Delight, I think it's more messy. I mean, it's very unsettling. The treatment of McKenna is very problematic, and the film doesn't rest on it. And I think that's more of Soloway as a filmmaker at that point in her, sort of experience as a filmmaker, because I think in her works afterwards, all she's ever doing in Transparent and I Love Dick is dealing with the messy consequences of her characters' intentions that are misplaced. But in Afternoon Delight, I don't think Soloway explores that fully, but I feel like we are meant to, although Rachel kind of gets herself together, there is an enormous misstep with McKenna. McKenna is not treated very well at all. You see that in, the exchange between the two women when McKenna gets in the cab. I mean, they can't even talk about it. Because it's just so complicated and it went so wrong, for both of them, but it just went so wrong.
Yeah, I think that's part of maybe the discomfort is that not only does Rachel mistreat McKenna, but I think Soloway mistreats McKenna as a character. I think we could have seen something more instead of being sort of encouraged to, forget that McKenna ever was there in the throes of an orgasm at the end, right? We're made to forget her when we shouldn't have to, or we're asked to forget her.
I want to I want to encourage the questions from the audience. We have some time left for questions now. I see we received at least one question, and so we're going to have, hopefully we can have more. I did want to. Why don't we actually, that seems like a very good question. So why don't we read that one now? I know it can be hard to change programs, but there's been some dead naming and misgendering in this talk. I hope the speakers can try next time to use the correct names and pronouns. That's very correct. So wanted to make sure that we did address that because of how tricky a situation that is. So I want to get back maybe to this question of Afternoon Delight's Jewishness. And just to ask this question of what do we think is actually taking place at the end of the movie when they light candles? and whether or not, what is this supposed to do on a kind of narrative perspective, whether or not we feel it is genuine, whether or not we feel that the characters have kind of moved in this direction towards openness. Why is it here? What is it doing?
I can jump in if, I mean, I think that generically comedy is a conservative genre. I mean, this gets to some of the things that we've just been talking about. Comedy is a conservative genre because in the end it affirms the existing order of things, at least this kind of romantic comedy. It's about the order is challenged and it meets the challenge, and everything is happily ever after, right? That means things end the way they're supposed to. And both of these movies are about an outsider who challenges a sort of content, maybe you could call it complacent, social order, and they cause sort of ripples in it, and then it ends up restoring itself and expelling them. And that is what comedy is. I mean, I don't think that that's necessarily grounds for criticism. I think that's the genre that these films are working in. But I think that it's interesting that if you're thinking about making that kind of a movie today, where do you, and this is something I got at in my opening remarks, in the past, it was possible to make that kind of romantic comedy because there were very strict conventions about how people behaved, especially in sort of middle-class society. And so people could challenge those conventions, and then the conventions could sort of be vindicated at the end. Today, I think there are obviously conventions about gender and sexuality are very different. They've changed a great deal, even since these movies were made. So where do you go to find a community where people are expected to act a certain way and there's a genuine risk in defying the social norms, and people feel that it's important to sort of be respectable in the end? Both of these movies say the sort of Jewish community of Los Angeles is what community like that. It's a place where in the strata that, certainly let's talk about Afternoon Delight, since that's more of a realistic Jewish movie. In a society like that, which I recognize completely because I feel like I live in a similar society myself and grew up in one, that your reputation matters. For a woman like Rachel, her reputation as a wife and mother is very important to her. She doesn't want to jeopardize it. And when McKenna comes with her sort of disruptive sexuality, and in the scene where she seduces one of the husband's friends, it's like she's saying, this is what I can do to you. This is what I have the power to do because I'm younger, because I am more sexually powerful than you. I can come and ruin your world. And that's also a Jane Austen phenomenon. I mean, that's like what happens in Pride and Prejudice, where the younger sister runs off and elopes and brings disgrace on the family, where the older sister gets married to a rich man and has the sort of match that she's supposed to. So the idea that female sexuality is dangerous and then can be done in a right way and a wrong way, and in the end, the Catherine Hahn character, Rachel, does it in the right way, which is that she doesn't want to break up her marriage. She doesn't want the husband to leave the family. She doesn't want to have sex with strangers. What she wants is to have her marriage to the man who's the father of her children be passionate, right? And that's the happy ending. And that's a conservative ending. It's saying the marriage is good. It just needs to be made to work better. It's not saying, smash the patriarchy. So it's especially interesting from a filmmaker who would then go on to be much more radical, that Afternoon Delight is a fairly traditional kind of comedy.
That connects actually to a question that I had for you, Adam, but really also for Maya, about, because she's this expert on these second wave feminist films from the 70s. So you've given us a kind of a way to understand the feminism in Afternoon Delight, part of Soloway's sort of journey toward a more radical kind of feminism, maybe. But I guess I want to hear from Maya how you understand the feminism of these two films, how they're reflections of their own feminist movements or moments in the 90s and 2010s. And what do you see that's changed in them from some of these films in the 70s that you write about, and what has not changed, what's repeated in these films?
Wow, that's a juicy question. Well, I mean, where to start? It's a hard one. I think Clueless Clueless is just so locked into the 90s. And again, Adam, I really appreciate how you are framing and just reminding us the conventionality and the genre conventions that are at work. And it's very cookie cutter, which is fine. I love traditional romantic comedies. It's fine, you know, even when they get on my nerves, it's okay. And I guess, you know, Clueless has its feminism because she's assertive, she's the central character, she has this arc, she learns something about herself, you know, and all eyes are on her. And I'd be happy to know from folks, you know, joining this talk, you know, what they think is Clueless's feminism in the early 90s. Afternoon Delight, again, I think its feminism is a little bit more messy. And, you know, and that certainly reflects the time in which it was made. I mean, as I said in my remarks, a lot of the characterizations and just the story is very familiar. And that's not a criticism at all. You know, it's the woman who's sort of caught between, you know, herself as an individual and then the responsibility of motherhood and of being partnered in a heteronormative relationship. And this is something that Soloway talked about at the time in which she made that film, that was so interesting to her at the time, as she identified as a woman and a mother and a partner in a heterosexual relationship. And you know, how it connects to the 70s. I mean, in the 70s, women filmmakers couldn't even say feminism. You know, if they were going to say feminist, and I, you know, this is something Claudia Weil always talked about back then and today, you know, you had to be ready because you were going to get in trouble for that. And sometimes I think we lose sight of that. I know certainly when I teach these kinds of films with my students, it's like a million years ago that folks couldn't even say, you know, to identify as a feminist was just, you know, maybe we're going to lose your job in Hollywood for sure. And so it's really leaps and bounds. That's not really answering your question, but it's a hard one. Somebody else jump in. It's a good one, but it's hard. Somebody else add something.
I mean, I think you could say that Clueless is an anti-feminist movie, and that partly comes from the source material, which is this Jane Austen novel that was written 200 years earlier, because what's the whole point of the movie? It's that she has to show that she's good enough for Josh, who's older and smarter and more mature and knows what's the right way to be, and she doesn't, because she's a 15-year-old teenage girl. And so the sort of way that she vindicates herself is to show that she's good enough to date Josh, right? And that's exactly from Emma, because in Emma, it's the same situation. She's a privileged young woman who's selfish and spoiled, and she has to show that she's a good enough person to marry Mr. Knightley. And Mr. Knightley is sort of the lover/father figure who, when you get his approval, that means that you've become a good person. And that's a completely unrealistic dynamic in the 1990s. And certainly, I don't think that kind of story reflects what was going on in Los Angeles or anywhere really for teenagers in the 1990s, which is one reason why Clueless is such an unusual movie, because it actually is very anachronistic in a lot of ways. And in a way, it reminds me of is Metropolitan, the Whit Stillman movie, which is also about sort of consciously creating also Jane Austen is referenced a lot in that movie. It's consciously creating a bubble society that defies what's going on in the larger society and allows you to go back and experience the kind of pleasure that you can get from traditional romantic comedies that aren't really being made anymore. And if you look at other teen movies, you know, what were some other teen movies of the mid 90s? One that comes to mind is Scream, very successful horror series, which is completely, you know, horrifying and all about women getting chopped up and murdered. And Clueless is sort of a reaction to that. It's saying, let's have a zone in this movie where everyone is nice and nothing bad happens and everyone is respectable because they're rich and they're beautiful. That's a nice zone to live in, and that's one of the purposes of romantic comedies, and still to this day is that it's not realistic.
I think the comparison with Metropolitan is fascinating because Stillman retrojects that movie. I mean, that movie takes place in the 1970s. It takes place at kind of, it's the last great debutante season. It's a movie that knows that the social structure of this world is coming to an end. And we're going to be the last people who can kind of rescue the damsel in distress, because afterwards, the damsels will not want to be rescued. Of course, it's ironic. I think that's why Stillman titled his fourth film "Damsels in Distress" as a way of kind of continuing this, this interrogation and this debate. I do wonder, though, if the mid-90s, I appreciate the notion that it is a kind of an anti-feminist film because of the conservative structure of the romantic comedy and this particular one from the source material. But I'm wondering if, if it does connect with the kind of pop feminism of, No Doubt, and this movie would have been right around the same time that Just a Girl was a very big hit, and kind of embracing that femininity and the colors palette associated with that, while also kind of asking for something much, much more.
Isn't there a No Doubt song on the soundtrack?
I think so. Yes, you're right.
I think too, I do wonder, though, to Adam's question about whether or not this is fantasy. I think that's correct. And especially interesting that you have Fast Times at Ridgemont High, the reality of the high school from the expose, and now moving it into this unreal zone with maybe perhaps the Mighty Mighty Bosstones kind of testing that hypothesis of, is this a fictional band that sounds like the Mighty Mighty Bosstones, or is it just that in their Beverly Hills, the Mighty Mighty Bosstones are the people who play concerts at the local at someone's party? So maybe I'm going to continue to encourage people to raise questions in the chat, but I did want to go back to Maya, your point about it being an LA movie and what kind of LA movie either of these movies are. So we were thinking about the space of LA when we put this together, and trying to have that contrast of the West Side movie versus the East Side movie, and starting on the West and having Beverly Hills as being this site where you have this settled family who've accumulated wealth and sculptures by kind of providing high-end services, to people in other industries. And then we have Afternoon Delight. We have this Silver Lake. It's a Silver Lake movie. We have this Josh Radnor's character makes apps, and Catherine Hahn appeared, as the homemaker who we see reorganizing her books by color. And everything is incredibly precise in that household. We see the pasta maker. We see the French press coffee. We see the juicer. This is a household where if they want to experience something, they're going to prepare it themselves in kind of the right way. And all the fruit are sorted by colors. It's very much kind of tying it into a specific milieu. And also the fact that, it revolves around, the narrative revolves around the East Side JCC and the East Side JCC mom. So Adam, you linked this to kind of your own, analogized it to Park Slope and this world that you're very familiar with. But I guess I'm asking to kind of root us back in Silver Lake and in that kind of community, and to see how do we understand it as an LA film? One of the funniest lines in the movie to me is when Michaela Watkins' character, after her husband has been, caught with McKenna, says, where I come from, the Palisades, women have each other's back. And it just doesn't see, it seems like, it's funny because of everything we think about when we think about the Palisades, if we think about the Palisades at all. So I guess an unfairly broad question, how do we think these movies kind of have captured, what is LA Jews on film? What is their geography? How do these movies kind of fit into this change? And how do these particular movies imagine the city? Do they make good use of it? I think a lot of us also are familiar with Neil Gabler's narrative of an empire of their own, of Jews kind of coming out, creating this Hollywood space in order to have this fictional world. But does that world of their own, does that empire include the city of Los Angeles, or is it really held, just beyond it, ending at the studio gates?
I feel like the LA people need to weigh in because I don't have a sense.
I live in LA. I'm living in LA right now. I'm living right next to Silver Lake right now. So I don't feel like I should answer this question. Too close. I
One
don't
thing I
want to
liked
bring in my personal experience.
Please do.
Movie
I think that, Adam has reflected on his own personal experience with both of these movies.
I know, and Adam, you did such a good job. I'm jealous that you could do that.
Because I'm not there anymore, so I can say whatever I want. But I'm not accountable.
I just don't, as I said before, I feel like the films stop short of really representing LA and perhaps even an LA Jewish experience, in just that, again, they fall short of representing LA. I mean, Silver Lake certainly has, folks like the characters in the film, but it's very diverse. And so for me, I want to see more of that. I mean, certainly if I'm going to go to a movie that is representing my neighborhood, and that's just the challenge, because then we say, well, filmmakers, can tell whatever story they want, of course. Moviegoers can go to movies with any kind of expectation that they have or their own personal experience, and and then pick or choose a film. But and again, I would say that Soloway, I think, in so much of what Joey Soloway says about their work today and just their position as a filmmaker or a media maker, that they really don't want to center around whiteness. They're really expanding to representation, in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality. And so that's where I think, again, Afternoon Delight is a jumping off point, I think, for better, more interesting representation of LA. Certainly and transparent, yeah.
Adam, there's a note in the chat about Emma and Emma's individual moral journey and learning the limits of her understanding. Do you think that applies to Cher?
I mean, I think it's sort of supposed to, but for various reasons, it's not as convincing as it is in the novel, partly because of the genre, partly because it's a movie versus a book, and the setting and the time also. I think all those things make it impossible to have the same kind of moral journey that Emma does, where she really sort of learns something about herself. Cher, I think there's a lot of scenes, especially towards the end in Clueless, where you can tell that the director was sort of saying, we got to show her getting better and becoming a better person. So let's have a scene where she volunteers for the Pismo Beach disaster, or let's have a scene where she's reading a book, and all those things will show that she's become a better person in a way that seems fairly artificial.
Well, they do at least get good humor out of the Pismo Beach disaster, of having kind of the 90s. There's three booths, at this fair where they're supposed to be doing community service, and one of them seems to be about sex, everything you wanted to know about sex and sex education, and then there's one next to it that's Save the World, and then Pismo Beach disaster. So it does kind of capture that myopia of, even when people are in this world are thinking broader, they're thinking about the central coast of California and a beach town that they're slightly familiar with, as opposed to thinking about the universe more globally. So we're coming close on time. So I do want to encourage any last questions from the audience. Paloma, you had several questions. Would you like to ask one now while we wait to see if the audience has any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I feel like just you guys have been so thorough with all of your responses. Most of my, let me look through, because I think most of my questions have already been answered. So
I had a question, maybe while you're thinking of more questions on your end. What are other studio teen films with female leads in the early mid 90s? I mean, because when I was preparing for this, all I can think of are the indie films, like, and so many films with a female protagonist, teen films or young adult films, Alison Anders, Gas Food Lodging, and Mi Vida Loca, Welcome to the Dollhouse, Just Another Girl on the IRT, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And so I just wondered if anybody, I can think of more dramas that were released by studios with a young female lead, but I don't know, like, what else is Clueless?
Valley Girl.
Valley Girls Valley Girls in the 80s.
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, that's like a precursor. But yeah, for the 90s, I just I don't know, I'm so stumped.
Following Scream, there was this whole like comedy horror high school genre, and there were several films like that took place with high school zombies and so on. I can't remember if there were women protagonists in any of those, but I do remember going to the theaters to watch them for some reason.
I mean, there's something about Clueless, if we're kind of debating, its feminist qualities and its problematic feminist qualities. I mean, the 90s is, the emergence of the chick flick, which has such a stigma in the 90s. And so I think in that way, Clueless, is so important and so radical. And Heckling talks about this in interviews, that she kind of got some pushback, that the main character would be, a woman or a young woman or a teen girl. So no wonder then that all the examples I'm thinking of, are coming from independent cinema, which of course in the early 90s is just really flourishing with that kind of Sundance generation. But
I think Adam is right that horror is like a real point where we see this. I think Scream comes out the next year after Clueless. I think that's 96. And then followed by I Know What You Did Last Summer and these other kind of imitators, The Class. I can't remember what year The Craft is from. That might also be that's also mid-1990s, but I'm blanking on the year. I think Buffy the Vampire Slayer is a little bit earlier than Clueless. I think that's 1992 or 1993.
And it's more funny. It's
right.
Horror, but it's funny. But yeah, I think I totally agree with the horror examples.
But I think what happens is that after the Hughes movies kind of fizzle out, the youth market then needs to be rediscovered.
And there's a real sexism in with studios in terms of having a female protagonist and a young female protagonist. And that's
I think that if there's a way to kind of close this out on a sort of optimistic note, it's that now I think that our streaming services are saturated with TV shows, maybe films too, that center women's pleasure, right? So if the great sort of outcome of Cher is that she figures out that she wants something and she figures out what she wants, it's not really so much about her desire, because she still has to do, as Adam expressed so clearly, she still has to prove to him that she's good enough. And then I think Rachel in Afternoon Delight, it is really about her finding a way to experience desire, pleasure, right? And the end of the movie, she does, we see that. But now we have shows like Pen 15, right? It's a Hulu show about two middle school girls where their pleasure is a part of the story, and it's not just about wanting a boyfriend because you're supposed to want a boyfriend. It's about wanting to experience pleasure, sexual pleasure, desire, all of those things. So I feel like we can find our way up on an upward trajectory towards centering these kinds of stories, even as, we might still get caught in some of these conventions that comedy demands of us, as Adam expressed, or because there's still institutionalized sexism all around us. But yeah, maybe that's my sort of optimistic closing note. Eitan, did you want to say anything?
I just want to thank everyone for coming today and for being here to talk about LA Jews with Adam Kirsch and Maya Montañez Smukler, Shana Hammerman and Paloma Eisenberg. I think that we've really gotten to the bottom of whether or not there are Jews in Los Angeles. I think by the end of this conversation, we can comfortably say that there are, and that some of them maybe even live in Silver Lake. Of that, I'm certain. This has been a great program to all year, and thank you for being here with us today to kind of close it out. The universe of Jewish film is very big, although it can seem very small. And I think one of the things that we've really emphasized this year in this program is just how many innovative films there were kind of either within the Hollywood system or just outside it. And the kind of particular navigation that these women filmmakers had to do in order to be able to have a kind of more place of self-expression. So one of the questions that we had repeatedly in talking about movies from the 70s or into the 1980s is we were faced with the kind of the lack of an infrastructure for independent film. That if you're Claudia Weil and you have a terrible studio experience after It's My Turn, that there isn't, say, like a Sundance circuit where you're going to get funded very, potentially easily in order to make that next feature, and that theater and television can be a much more accommodating space. But as we've moved a little bit later in time, we see the proliferation of these other media channels, as Maya was so eloquently, as Maya so elegantly phrased it. So it's been wonderful to kind of navigate this and to look at a lot of this creativity that came out of Hollywood in this time, from the enjambment of second wave feminism, as Maya describes in her book, and also from the particularity of Jewish experience and how that ended up being a factor in certain of these films as well. That the Jewishness is integral to Girlfriends. The Jewishness is integral to Desperately Seeking Susan. The Jewishness is pervasive in Clueless, even as it may not be explicit, that its imagined Los Angeles is one where Jewishness is just taken for granted, and felon and bugging are both completely normal idioms that someone might use. So I want to thank everyone for being here with us, and stay tuned for information about next year.